Hi students, welcome to another note video. Today we are going to be talking about new movements in America. So we're focusing on sort of the mid-1800s, right before the Civil War is when most of these events will be happening, but they could kind of, some of them will pick up more steam even after the Civil War. Sorry, excuse me. So make sure you have your notes open and we will go ahead and quickly get started. And just so you know, at the end of this, I will be going over your next digital worksheets and explaining those. So here we go. If it will load. Okay, so the first thing we have to talk about is a new wave of immigrants coming over in the mid-1800s and where they're coming from and what their experiences are going to be. And we've already talked about immigrants coming to the colonies and to the United States once it becomes a country. And, at first it's a lot of English immigrants. We get other people from Europe as well, but England is one of the first, big waves. And we also when we talked about the gold rush, right, a big wave of Chinese immigrants coming over. So we've discussed immigration a little bit so far, but, and sort of, the opposition that the Chinese faced when they came over for the gold rush. But in the mid-1800s, you're going to see a new wave of immigrants coming over from Ireland and from Germany. And the ones coming over from Ireland are because of the potato famine, right? The Irish really depended on the potato. There was an infection in the crop, and Irish people started starving to death because all the potatoes were like diseased and they couldn't eat them anymore. And it also has to do with England and not having a really good relationship with England at the time. And in fact, England actually passing a lot of laws to not help Ireland in any way. And so a lot of Irish people are going to leave and come to the United States in hopes of a better life. And in Germany, there was an attempt at a revolution and overthrowing the government there, and that did not go so well. And so a lot of people are going to leave Germany as well and come over to the United States, again, for the hopes of a new and better life. And just like we've seen in history before, and just like we see in current times, whenever there's a new wave of immigrants, people freak out and they have fears about the new immigrants. And one big fear is that immigrants are going to take everybody's jobs. And that's because, right, immigrants would often be willing to work for cheaper wages, right? That means like make less money than an average person living in America. And but as we've seen also time before, and what we'll see in the future as well in these in one of our later units, is that actually a lot of immigrants are actually taking the jobs that most people don't want. Right, working in slaughterhouses and things like that. Not many people want to do that, and it's actually immigrants who are going to be willing to take those jobs. And as we see in history, right, that group of new immigrants will eventually sort of be settled in more, and things will calm down, and there'll be a new wave of immigrants for people to freak out about. So just remember, history repeats itself. Stay calm, and don't be afraid of immigrants. So nativists were people that were against immigration, and they actually formed their own political party called the Know Nothing Party, and they wanted to make it more difficult for immigrants to become citizens. So now we're going to talk a little bit about like urban challenges as well. We talked a little about immigration, a little bit about urban challenges. So we had previously discussed the Industrial Revolution, right, where we see this rise in like factories and people going to work in factories, and right, they're leaving behind their farms and they're moving closer to the factories. And so you're going to see more people moving to cities, and cities are just going to grow very fast. And some of them are just growing so fast they don't have enough housing to keep up with the demand. And so places like New York are going to start building very cheap apartment buildings to sort of help with this problem. And you're going to see a lot of overcrowding in these apartments as well. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But because of Industrial Revolution, we also see the rise of something called the middle class, right? So it's kind of between being the very poor and between being very the rich. It's the middle class. So as I said, because there's such a rise in cities and such a rapid growth, there's just not the facilities to house all the people that are coming into the United States and coming into the cities and coming to like work in these factories. And so a lot of immigrants are going to live in these poorly designed apartments that we call tenements. And there weren't a lot of laws back then that protected like renters, right? Landlords could kind of get away with doing whatever they wanted and not upkeeping the buildings and not really following any sort of codes. And so immigrants were living in like, you know, multiple families in one little unit, like 15 people in a small little like one bedroom apartment. And it was just crowded. Sometimes they didn't have windows. Sometimes, there's like water leaks and all sorts of just really bad conditions. And there's also not a lot of public health safety awareness going on. A lot of like factories are dumping chemical, like their products, like their waste from their factories, like directly into rivers. People dump trash into rivers as well, and then that water goes back into their homes, and they're consuming it and washing things with it. And so you're seeing diseases spread not just through the water, but also through these like tight apartment buildings that people are living in. And also, interestingly enough, a lot of these big cities did not have any sort of permanent like police officers or fire protection. A lot of that didn't exist yet and wasn't necessarily permanent, and sometimes came up just when it was necessary. So you can kind of see it's a little bit like the wild, wild west still, essentially. And what's important to see is sometimes when life is really hard and you're going through like a really tough situation, you're trying to find like an escape, like a way to feel okay. And for a lot of people, that comes through the arts, and not just like painting. That can be like reading, writing, lots of different ways. And so as all this is going on in the cities and life is really rough, you're going to see the rise of a movement called transcendentalism. And it's the belief that people could transcend, or they could rise above material things in life, and that you could really find like spiritual freedom through like nature and like being at one with yourself rather than focusing on like material goods. So some famous transcendentalists were Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, and Henry David Thoreau. And as far as in the art community, romanticism was a very popular technique, right? Which is a very like love of nature. And right, if you romanticize something, it means like you're not actually necessarily showing the truth of what you see, but you're coming up with a version that is something that you like and you think other people might like as well. Right, so they're not drawing these rivers floating with factory waste, right? They're drawing a river that looks beautiful with like birds chirping next to it. It's a romanticized view of what's going on. Some popular writers of the time as well were Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter, Edgar Allan Poe and his The Raven, which I believe you guys are familiar with, and Emily Dickinson was writing her poems, which I know you're also familiar with that too, but they of course would not be published until much later. But it kind of gives you an idea, right? If you think about The Raven, you think about Emily Dickinson, what were the things that they were writing about, and does that reflect on what was going on in society at the time, or was it an escape for them from society at the time? Okay, so next we're going to get into this section where we're going to talk about reforming society. So, right, you're seeing things are not going so great. Factory life is difficult, it's dangerous, it's dirty, and we have other issues in our country like slavery. And why isn't anybody trying to stop it and do something? Well, there will be people. And a lot of it will come from the Second Great Awakening. So all the way back in the beginning of the year, we talked about the First Great Awakening, which was a religious revival in the 13 colonies, right? These pastors would travel from colony to colony, and they would give these really fiery sermons where they would like be like, come to Jesus, and people would just like, they would faint, and like it was just very dramatic. And we talked about it because, yeah, okay, people came back to Christianity, but we also talked about that movement because it gathered people from all over the colonies, and they started to like talk to each other. And it was kind of one of the first early times where people communicated from colony to colony. And they're like, oh, hey, what's it like in your colony? How are the British treating you? So that was back in the First Great Awakening. So that was back in early colonial times of before it was America. And the Second Great Awakening is again another religious revival. So that's where people are like returning back to Christianity. And as they're doing that, right, think of them like opening up their dusty Bibles and they're like, oh, like I'm supposed to be good to other people. I'm supposed to help the poor. This is what it says in here. It says, love my neighbor as myself. Like, am I actually doing that? No. So I need to do something about it. And so this is going to cause a lot of people to get involved in movements to try and fix society. So one movement is the temperance movement. And many people believed that Americans drank too much and that that was really what caused problems in our country. That's what led to family violence, to criminal behavior. And so a movement emerges to not necessarily, like originally, it's not necessarily to like ban all alcohol. Originally, it's like the idea of, hey, you should have more self-discipline, like, use in moderation. And, we should probably just stop drinking all hard liquor. Beer and wine is okay, but like use moderation. Instead of having 10 glasses, have one. And this started in the 1830s, but it's not going to really pick up more steam until 90 years after this, when we have an amendment to the Constitution, which actually bans alcohol in the United States completely. That will be overturned. But for a while, you cannot have any alcohol in the United States, and kind of starts here back in the 1830s. But like I said, it eventually kind of picks up speed as time goes on. Another reform movement is the prison reform movement. So what helps to know is that there weren't a lot of places to send people that needed help back in the 1800s. So in prisons, it's not just a criminal, right? Someone who's like murdered his entire family. Those people are in prison, yes, but you also have mentally ill people. You have runaway children. You have orphans, because there's really not a lot of orphanages around. And all of these people are living in prisons. And guess what? The prisons are not great. Prisoners are chained to walls. They are tortured. They are starved. They're put in cages. They're treated completely like animals. And if you think that, okay, the family murderer deserves this, again, let's remember it's not just the criminals in there. There's like mentally ill people who need help that are in there, right? So this lady, Dorothea Dix, she wants to bring awareness to this, and so she travels to many of these prisons. She writes about her experiences. There's some sketches made about the way that she saw inmates being treated, and she is going to present her information. And thanks to her work and her writing and her reports, there's some big changes made to the prison system. One, state hospitals are introduced, and that's a place where mentally ill people can go and get help. That's a whole nother long story about those hospitals and how it's going to go from there. But I understand the attempt to at least get the mentally ill out of the prison system. But the state hospitals are a whole nother thing. That's a whole conversation for another time. Okay. Children who had committed a crime were sent to reform schools instead of sent to prison with adults. And prisons stopped using punishment alone to change behavior in prisons. So another big area of improvement is with education. So we already know, right, a lot of children were going to work in factories because, some families like really couldn't afford to not have their kids making money to help out. And as long as they knew how to read the Bible and, do writing and some simple math, it's fine. Girls are mostly kept at home. They might be educated a little bit in the home, but they're going to be educated more on like homemaking. Teachers often were not educated or trained in really any way. There weren't like requirements for that. And if the poorer the community, the worse the school was. So there was this idea called the Common School Movement, led by a group of people. Horace Mann is really in charge of that, and he thought that like all children, regardless of who they are, like their gender, their race, they all deserve the right to have like the same and good education. And so he convinced many of the states to give more money to the schools. And by doing that, he could raise teacher salaries, right? So if you offer more money for a job, you're going to get better candidates than when you offer like a really low salary. And he also begins the first teacher school for, like the first like school to train teachers on how to actually teach their classes. Okay, so next movement is the movement to end slavery. One of the first and earliest anti-slavery societies movement was actually started back by Ben Franklin, but it doesn't really gain a lot of support. But eventually, obviously, as we know now, as we're getting into the 1800s and slavery is just continuing to expand, there's going to be more Americans that are going to be interested in abolition, which is like the complete end to slavery. They had different reasons. People had different reasons for being against slavery. Some was, for religious reasons. Some people just thought it was straight up wrong. And some people had different ideas about once the slaves were free, what happens next. Some people believed in complete equality. And some people said, no, like, they can be free, but they could never be equal to a white person. So there's a lot of different views in this one movement. So how would they get people to hear about their movement to end slavery? How would you think about this, how would you convince somebody who owns slaves to give up their slaves? All right, we learned in class about how much a slave on average cost back then and how much that is in today's dollars. So how and why could you convince somebody to give up their slaves? So what abolitionists would do is they'd go on speaking tours. So they would go around to, different towns and give speeches and try to, tell people what it was like for the slaves. Newspaper articles were written as well. One famous abolitionist was William Lloyd Garrison, and he helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society. And he wanted, in his group, it was all about immediate freedom for slaves and complete equality for African Americans. And again, that wasn't necessarily what everybody believed. Some other members of this movement are Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who were two Southern women who grew up alongside let me explain that better. They grew up in a family that owned slaves, and they knew many of the children as slaves. And one day, witnessed their father punishing a slave, and it really opened their eyes to how horribly they were treated. And so these women grow up with this, and they actually kind of escape, go to the north, learn about this movement, and go back to the south and preach to different people in the south to try and convince them to get rid of their slaves and end slavery. Also, many former slaves were involved in the anti-slavery movement. So one famous one, of course, was our guy Frederick Douglass. You guys know a lot about Frederick Douglass already, so I won't go into a lot of detail about him. But as you know, he was a former slave. He is half black and half white, and he went on speaking tours and spoke about what he witnessed. You are currently, or I'm not sure if you've already finished, reading his autobiography. So he actually wrote about his stories as well. Remember that somebody said that he was so eloquent, he was so well spoken, there was no way he could ever be a slave. That's what somebody said about him. And he also published a newspaper called the North Star. And I really like this quote from him. It's in regards to the 4th of July holiday. And he said, "The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn." Right? 4th of July is when we celebrate our freedom, our independence. But for many African Americans, right, who are still in slavery, and just seeing this irony of starting a country based on this idea that all men are created equal, that we all are born with rights, and yet if you have a certain skin color, somehow that does not make you equal and does not mean you have equal rights. So I thought that's a powerful quote from Frederick Douglass. Another famous person involved in the anti-slavery movement is Sojourner Truth, who herself was also a former slave, and she used to travel around, and look at her, she's so like delicate and frail, but she'd give these fiery speeches about ending slavery, and not only that, but also promoting women's rights. So I like this quote from her. She said, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And look at me. No man could heed me." That means like outwork me. "And ain't I a woman?" Oof, you say it, Sojourner. So we actually kind of talked about this in a past set of notes, but I'll bring it up here. A big part of this anti-slavery movement is not only bringing awareness and telling people to end slavery, but actually also helping slaves escape. And that is done through the Underground Railroad. So it's not an actual railroad underground. That would be really cool if it was, but it's actually a network of people who are going to help slaves get to freedom, right? Help them get across and travel across the South and make it to the North or up to Canada. And they'll hide them, they'll transport them, and really do anything that they can to help them. Many of the people who helped on this were free African Americans and former slaves, and of course some white abolitionists as well. One of the most famous people that helped on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. They called her a conductor on the Underground Railroad, right? They use like the railroad terms. She herself was also a slave and had escaped, and was living free and realized she needed to go back and help free her family and hundreds of other slaves as well. And people called her like the Black Moses because she was like leading people to like the promised land of the North. Oh, I thought that was so cool. She was like a really cool lady who helped so many people and risked her life every time going back there and helped so many other people make it to freedom. So if you ever get a chance, I encourage you learn more about Harriet Tubman. I have a little link here, actually, to help you learn more about Harriet Tubman. I forgot this was in here. So I encourage you, if it's in your notes, to click on it. If not, if you just look up TED Ed and Harriet Tubman, you should be able to find it. But highly recommend it. I can't play it on here because the sound will be really weird. Okay. Of course, there are going to be people who are against all of these reform movements, right? For various reasons, but there's of course going to be people who are against ending slavery. Some people didn't want to end slavery because they were worried their jobs would be taken by freed slaves. Okay. Southerners said slavery was just like vital to their economy, right? That's how they made money. It's part of their culture, and you can't take away part of their culture. Southerners also believed like that Northerners were just interfering and they didn't understand their way of life and how things were done in the South, and that you do things differently in the North than we do in the South. Interesting. I disagree with all of those. Hopefully you do too. I think this is our last sort of reform movement we're talking about, which is the women's rights movement. And just like the temperance movement, this is like the early stages of it in the 1800s. It's really going to pick up a lot more steam in the early 1900s, and eventually the passing of the 19th Amendment, giving the woman the right to vote, which it goes into effect in 1920, is signed before that. But early movement is, of course, important as well. So many women were involved in these different reform movements I talked about, right? You saw Dorothea Dix was kind of like the head of one of these movements. And some of them were criticized because they were getting involved in things and they weren't staying at home and taking care of the family, and they were giving speeches. But for women, this was like really empowering. And they're like, hey, like a man can do this, like why can't I as well? And so many women are going to like take advantage of like this reform in education, and they'll become more educated. They'll learn how to organize themselves better to like fight for these rights. And the main right that women are going to be looking for is, of course, the right to vote. Right? Women couldn't vote. They couldn't sit on a jury, which, let's point out the irony in that. If a woman was convicted of a crime, right, the jury, those are the people that listen to her case, and they get to vote and if she's guilty or not. Okay? And it's supposed to be, they call it a jury of your peers. Okay, and this whole jury would be made up of men because women couldn't be on a jury. Huh, interesting. Not a jury of my peers. And women also had no control over their property. So anything that they made, like money-wise, anything that they owned, actually belonged to their husband. And in a sense, they belonged to their husband as well. Of course, there are going to be people against this movement. And I'm trying to remember if I have the definition of suffrage on either of these slides, and I don't think I do, which I should. So let me be clear. The word suffrage means the right to vote. So these women are fighting for women's suffrage. They want women to have the right to vote. But of course, there are people like these in this picture that are against women's suffrage, and they don't want women to have the right to vote. And here is a headquarter for that. Interesting. So some famous women that are involved in the early movement, and again, more women will join later. These are just women involved in the early movement, and some of them are very famous, and you should hopefully know their names. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she's up there in the right corner, and Lucretia Mott is down here in the bottom. These were two ladies that were not only abolitionists, but also involved in women's rights, and that was actually typical to be involved in multiple reform movements. And these ladies announced this thing called the Seneca Falls Convention, and it's the first time there's ever a public, large-scale meeting about women's rights held in the U.S., and this doesn't happen until 1848, which is pretty interesting. So at this meeting, the ladies who attend actually write a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, and it details a list of social injustice that women have experienced and what sort of changes they want to see. So it's very, very forward and very revolutionary, really, for their time. Other ladies involved in the movement as well are going to be Lucy Stone, that's her up at the top, and Susan B. Anthony, which is probably the lady that you've heard the most because she's been, I think, on the gold dollar coin, and she is the one who's going to help turn the fight political. And these two ladies are going to join the movement and help bring a lot of awareness. And what they're going to do, they're going to organize marches, they're going to talk to people, petition people, but what you have to think about is if women get the right to vote, that's technically taking away, at this point, who has all the say in the government and the laws and everything? It's all men. It's all white men, because no African American men or anything like that have any sort of right to vote or anything like that. So it's all white men. So by choosing to give power to women, you're giving away power. And do people like to give away power? No. People want more power. So you're asking people to, I guess maybe the right word isn't give away, it's to share power, right? But I guess some people maybe more see it as give it away. And these ladies are no, we can share. This can be a country for all of us, and all of our voices can be reflected in it, not just a small group of people, but what about the rest of us? Right? Nowadays, I think women make up more than men in the United States. So let's share. But sadly, women won't gain many rights for a long time. Like I said, it's going to not be until the 1920 when the right to vote will be granted to women. But regardless, these ladies who are involved in these early fights and these early movements are really paved the way for that. Oh, and that's my last slide. Perfect. So from there, we've talked about our reform movements. I will jump over to our digital worksheet. So the first one we are going to do is called Immigration Waves. And so what you do is there's two little links here, and you want to click on one of them. I'll start with the first one. It's this link here. And it says, click on the link to learn about the major immigration waves to the United States. On your key, create a color for each box, then place a corresponding dot in each country that immigrated during that wave. 2 blank dots have been placed on the right. Use one for each wave, then copy and paste as necessary. Okay, so we scroll down to the key, right? A key just tells you what the information you need to know about. The information you need to know about the map. Sorry, I went down to the next page. So it says the first wave we're looking up is called the first wave, and it's from 1790 to blank. So if we go to our website, it says first wave. Oh, sorry, it looked like this. I just scrolled down. First wave, 1790 to blank. So it's 1820. So you want to make sure you come back here and write 1820. And then we need to give this a color. So to do that with the color, you just click on the box. And then up here, there's a little paint bucket. So click on that. I'll click on the color red so it's easier for you guys to see. So now I'm telling you that the first wave of immigrants is going to be represented by red on my map. Okay, so what I want to do now is figure out who was a part of this first wave. And here on this website, it actually gives me a list. And so now what I want to do is put a dot for each of those people groups on my map. Okay, so it says English, Scots, Scots-Irish, Germans. Okay, so on here, I'm going to go up to my circle, and I'm going to click on one of them. It doesn't matter which one. And I'm going to, again, change the paint color, match it to the one I just did. And now I'm going to copy and paste this dot in all the places of where those immigrants went to. So let me do that. I'm going to copy. I remember that they said Scotland is up here. I think they said Irish as well. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I got to actually drag it over there. Huh? I'm going to paste my dot again, and I'll move this one over to Ireland, which is right there. And by the way, if you do not have the map of Europe memorized, it's okay. I don't think I did in 8th grade as well. What you can do is back up here at the top, I gave you a link where it says country, and if you click on that, it'll take you to a map of Europe. The one thing to not get confused about is, right, nowadays it says the United Kingdom, but right, if you zoom in, it'll give you more of a breakdown of what the United Kingdom is. And the United Kingdom, sorry, excuse me, has England right down here, Scotland up here, Wales and Northern Ireland over there. So in case you needed to know that. I think it also said Germans. So I'll look on my map. Germany is right here. So then I want to make sure, again, I copy my dots. I'm going to do Control C, Control V, and I want to drag that dot over here to Germany. So anyways, you do that for each of the groups here. What I will point out is for Puritans, a lot of them are coming from England. So as long as you have a dot on England, you're good for Puritans. And then in the second wave, I'm trying to think if there's any. No, this is pretty clear about where they're coming from. Okay, so that's how you complete this one. So make sure you do the rest of your red dots and then move on to the next color. For the last worksheet, it says push and pull factors. And so you're going to investigate what would cause somebody to be pushed to come to the United States and pulled to leave their other country. Oh, sorry, I don't think I explained that very well. Just a second, I need a cough. Okay, sorry. Okay, pushed from their homelands and pulled to the United States. Sorry if I didn't explain that well. So basically, why would someone want to leave their homeland, and what would the United States offer that their old homeland didn't offer? So under push factor, right, you could put something like Irish potato famine, right? We talked about that. That would definitely be something that would make people want to leave their old country, and a reason why to leave their old country. And if you don't remember anything like this, of course there's links up here, so I'll go ahead and click on one for you. Cool. Ooh, maybe I want to go on the other one. It'd be a little easier to show you. Let's try the second one. Okay. Oh, actually, this is the same one that was on the other page that has push-pull factors up here. So, right, sorry, I feel like I didn't explain that very well. A push factor is something that would make somebody want to leave their homeland, right? Like potato famine or failed revolution. A pull factor is what does that other country offer that would make you want to go there? So, for example, a pull factor could be new opportunities. A pull factor could be these American letters. So I'd read about that if you don't know anything about that. Those could be some ideas of pull factors, and the other website as well lists some more too. So I might put the one about new opportunities. So in each box, it's actually really simple. You only opportunities. For each box, you only need to put one, and you're just doing a couple of them there. So that's it of your worksheets and of your notes, and hopefully that made more sense. If not, just click on those links again, and of course, ask for help if you need it. Okay, thanks for